Hello, everyone. I'm Kelly Hancock. I'm the Public Programs Manager at the American Civil War Museum here in Richmond, Virginia. And I've got a couple of in-person events to tell you about. In August, we will have with us Ken Rutherford. He'll be speaking on Americans' Buried History, Landmines in the Civil War. He will be doing an in-person talk in Richmond at ACWM at Historic Tredegar on August the 14th at 1 o'clock. And then on August the 20th, he will be out in Appomattox at our museum there. And that talk in Appomattox will be at 2 p.m. So just note the time difference. You can always go to our website to get the information as well. And then for our virtual audience, we have a book talk scheduled for July 28th. This will be with Angela Elder. She'll be speaking on her book, Love and Duty, Confederate Widows and the Emotional Politics of Loss. And that will be on July 28th, Thursday evening at 6:30. So mark your calendars for those upcoming events. And for tonight, I am very pleased to introduce our guest author, Scott Mingus. He is a scientist and consultant in the global pulp and paper industry, and he holds patents in self-adhesive postage. I am not talking very well. He holds patents in self-adhesive postage stamps and barcode labels, which I think is just completely fascinating. We were talking a little bit about that before everyone joined us. He is from Ohio. He graduated from the Paper Science and Engineering program at Miami University. He has written 19 Civil War and Underground Railroad books. His biography of Confederate General William Extrabilly Smith won multiple awards, including the Dr. James I. Robertson Jr. Literary Award for Confederate History. And he has also written articles for many publications, including Gettysburg Magazine. Scott Mingus is here tonight with us to talk about the book that he co-authored with Joe Owen. So with that, I am going to turn the screen over to Scott.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thumbs up, Kelly. Can you see the screen okay? Sounds good. Again, I appreciate the warm welcome. Greetings from York, Pennsylvania, where Debbie and I have lived for the last 21 years after moving here to take over directing the research and development activities for a global paper company based here in York. Over the years, I've always been known as a Gettysburg campaign guy, as somebody who writes predominantly about the Eastern Theater, including the railroads here in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and extensively, of course, on the march into Pennsylvania. About 2 years ago or so, 3 years ago, maybe now, Joe Owen had contacted me and said he had a lot of tremendous resource material for Texans at the Battle of Chickamauga. Now, he had previously did some work on Texans at Gettysburg and Texans at Antietam, but those books were very much compilations, if you will, of the primary source material, so the researchers could read that material, interpret for himself. What Joe and I wanted to do with this book was something a little bit different. I tend to write narrative history, and I wanted to tell stories based on what the soldiers said they did and how to go about do it. So Ted Savis and I, my publisher, decided this book was really interesting and we should be worthy of coming out in print. So Joe and I collaborated, and the book's now been very popular in its first 3 months out. So we're very pleased with the response. But let's go back to 1863. Let's take a look at what was going on then. And for some reason, my screen is not advancing. Okay, there we go. Here's the tactical situation in the middle part of the Western Theater. On December 31st, 1862 and January 1st, 1863, the Union Army and the Confederate Army of Tennessee, Union Army of the Cumberland, had fought each other to a frazzle along the banks of Stones River near Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Those two armies had really accomplished very little in terms of any strategic change to the situation in Middle Tennessee. But what they had accomplished is frustrate both presidents, both Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln are going to, over the next few months, start putting political pressure on both Braxton Bragg, the commander of the Confederate Army of Tennessee, and William Rosecrans, the commander of the Union Army of the Cumberland. After the battle, over time, Bragg had withdrawn much of his army into the Plateau Highlands north of the Duck River, again in Middle Tennessee. It's kind of centered around the town of Tullahoma, where he had his headquarters. Now, over time, throughout the winter and early spring, the weather was miserable. Not a lot was going on. The troops' morale was coming down. Bragg was getting some reinforcements for his army, particularly men who had been captured the previous year in Arkansas at Arkansas Post at the Battle of Fort Inman. So these troops are coming back in, many of which are Texans and Arkansans who again had surrendered with the fall of Fort Inman, but now we're back in the ranks. So Bragg's slowly getting more and more troops as the year progresses, but he's not doing much. He's just kind of sitting there. More frustrating on the Union side, Abraham Lincoln is really starting to push William Rosecrans to do something, do anything, just start moving, start putting pressure on Bragg, because again, it's pretty much a stalemate in Middle Tennessee throughout much of the early 4 or 5 months of 1863. Obviously, the War Departments on both armies got their attention span on the east. You've got the Chancellorsville campaign going on. Of course, Gettysburg campaign will happen that summer as well. But in the West, the situation in Tennessee is actually somewhat stale and stagnated, and that's not acceptable to Abraham Lincoln. So as the weeks drag by, he starts putting more and more and more pressure on General Rosecrans to get a move on it, to go attack Bragg. Finally, at long last, Rosecrans will begin in June of 1863, again, 159 years ago this month. He will finally start moving towards the south and will start heading towards Bragg's army. Now, Bragg has reinforced several mountain passes, trying to slow down or hopefully stop, in his mind, any penetration by the Union Army of the Cumberland through these key mountain gaps. There's a low mountain range called the Highland Rim, with a number of small little hills and mountains. There's some gaps, a couple of key gaps in there in this mountain range. One is which is known as Hoover's Gap. At Hoover's Gap, John T. Wilder's Lightning Brigade will attack and actually carry Hoover's Gap. Now, that's a critical part of the early part of the campaign because Wilder's men are utilizing multiple shot, 7-shot Spencer repeating rifles. They have been privately purchased. Some of them are government issued, but most of these have been paid for by other means. They are able to successfully push the Confederates back. Bragg will continue to fall back rather slowly. As you can see on the map, Rosecrans will continue to pursue and will keep this leapfrogging. Similar to what's going to happen in 1864 in North Georgia, happens in the summer of 1863 in Middle Tennessee, where the Confederates will retreat, the Union will try to flank them, the Confederates will retreat, Yankees will flank them again, and it just becomes this game of who's going to flinch first. And finally, Bragg will retreat towards the Tennessee River in July. Now, this campaign has done a few things. Number one, it has reinforced in the minds of both Jeff Davis and Abraham Lincoln that these two commanders are on relatively shaky ground. Two, it has given a time for both armies to start thinking about reinforcements. In fact, Jefferson Davis and the Confederate War Department are starting to strip troops from Mississippi, from Joseph Johnston's Army of Mississippi, and they're putting them on trains and starting to send them north towards Georgia. The War Department, of course, in both Richmond and Washington have also got to be concerned about what's going on in the Eastern Theater at that point in time. So there's really a lot of focus being held there. Now, the key to the whole campaign is Chattanooga. Chattanooga, of course, in southern Tennessee on the Tennessee River, widely regarded in those days as the gateway to the South. It's a huge, huge, very important Confederate ordnance and supply place. There's a lot of military hospitals there. You've got 4 railroads that intersect or at least come together at Chattanooga. So this is an incredibly important place, and it's a key to any Union attempts to start moving south into Georgia. You need to take Chattanooga. And so Rosecrans is starting to mentally prepare for the fact he's going to have to attack this fairly heavily fortified town, where again, Bragg has got literally his whole army. Now, on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863, the headlines, of course, are dominated by the Battle of Gettysburg. The headlines on July 4th are dominated by the surrender of Vicksburg. What is buried in the fine print is Bragg's decision on July 4th to move away from Chattanooga and start heading farther south and pretty much abandon Chattanooga completely to the Union cause. Again, that'll prove to be a controversial decision, but it's the one that Bragg feels he needs to make. Now, as he is making this movement starting farther south, he does have reinforcements that have arrived. I mentioned earlier. Some of these reinforcements are Texans. And so let's take a quick interlude, if you will, and let's look at the various Texan units that are in Bragg's Army of the Tennessee. I mentioned briefly about troops that had been captured by William T. Sherman when Arkansas post garrison at Fort Hindman in Arkansas had surrendered earlier in the year. Brigadier General James Deschler commanded one of these brigades of what becomes derisively known as the Arkansas Post Parolees. Much like at the Battle of Gettysburg in the East, Willard's brigade becomes known as Harper's Ferry Cowards for having surrendered with Dixon Miles at Harper's Ferry in September of 1862. Much like that, here in the Western Theater, the veterans make fun of these Arkansas Post Parolees, thinking they shouldn't have surrendered, they should have kept fighting. There's no reason in the world for these guys to have laid down their arms to William T. Sherman. Now, Sherman and Deschler, kind of interesting, had a relationship. Deschler is still, I'm from just outside of Columbus, Ohio, in a town called Zanesville. The Deschler name is still all over the Columbus area. And in fact, William T. Sherman, when Deschler is his prisoner back earlier in 1863, starts, small talk. Hey, I know the Deschler family here in Ohio. Are they related to you, etc.? And James Deschler wants absolutely nothing to do with any kind of social small talk with his conquering general. Despite Sherman's best efforts trying to engage Deschler into some friendly conversation, Deschler just says enough's enough and kind of strides away. Well, when Deschler is released, he is given command of a consolidated brigade. So they're taking what's these parolees and they're kind of squeezing what had been entire regiments into single regiments. For example, they're consolidating the 6th and 10th Texas Infantry with the 15th Texas Dismounted Cavalry. Now, Texas had a lot of cavalry regiments that had no horses at this point in the war. In fact, many of them had been stripped of their horses quite early in the war and have been fighting as dismounted infantry ever since. But they're still called dismounted cavalry, or as they're more commonly known, just simply the 15th Texas Cavalry. Well, those three regiments, if you will, are so small they're combined into one now consolidated regiment. Similarly, the 17th, 18th, and 24th and 25th dismounted Texas Cavalry are combined into one unit. The 19th and 24th Arkansas Infantry, again, combined into one unit. And so this new brigade made up of these, again, parolees, men who don't have the greatest reputation within the Army of the Army of the Tennessee. They are joined by a veteran artillery battery under James Douglas. These guys are really good. They've fought hard at Stones River and other places like that. They're veterans. They add some stability as well as firepower. They've got two 6-pound smoothbore cannons, and they've got two 12-pounder howitzers. So they've got 4 guns, very, very deadly at close range, particularly for defensive fighting, but obviously not the best at long range fighting, being smoothbores. The next brigade that has joined the Army is Matthew Ector's brigade. That's come up from Texas or from Mississippi, among other places. Deschler is an Alabama native. Ector is a Georgia native. But again, both men are commanding troops that are predominantly soldiers from Texas. Unlike Deschler, who is a West Point graduate who graduated with his good friend, Jeb Stuart, and had served in the United States Army in California and Utah, and was an extremely experienced soldier and was actually quite highly thought of. Matthew Ector is kind of a different story. Now, Matt Ector reminds me so much of Marshall Dillon. If you remember the old show Gunsmoke, that's Matt Ector. Big, tall, strapping, no nonsense kind of a guy, kind of the friendly sheriff, if you will, the Matt Dillon stereotype. Matt Ector, again, not Matt Dillon, but Matt Ector is quite the antithesis of James Deschler. He's a political officer. He's won his appointment by being quite a good politician in the state of Georgia. He's also served in a number of other political roles. He's come to Texas, and now he commands some actual regiments of Texas troops, both infantry and, again, dismounted cavalry. And he's also got some troops from Missouri in his arrangement as well. The next unit is the famed Terry's Texas Rangers. Colonel Tom Harrison, who is from Texas, commands the 8th Texas Cavalry, which goes down in fame as the Texas Rangers, obviously laying rise to the name that will be used for the post-war cowboy organization, if you will, law enforcement group that will enforce Texas's laws in the next 30 or to 40 to 50 years, and certainly are resurrected to chase Bonnie and Clyde, etc. But the Terry's Texas Rangers, Terry's gone by this point in time, and Tom Harrison commands both the 8th and 11th Texas. The final group of Texans that we want to immediately chat about is John Gregg's brigade. These guys had fought very well at the Battle of Raymond under Joseph Johnston down in Mississippi. They had been hot rushed by rail. They had joined the Army of Tennessee on its movement out of Tennessee into Georgia. These guys are really good troops, really good troops. John Gregg, again, is not a professional soldier, another politician. He's a professor. He kind of reminds me a little bit of Joshua Chamberlain. He's a professor who can fight. He's also a newspaper man. He has served as a representative in the Confederate Congress. Most of his troops are from Tennessee, but he has one very crack and very, very talented colonel in the name of Hiram Granberry. Granberry will go on to become a general. The Confederate Army will be one of the 6 Confederate generals that will die in 1864 at the Battle of Franklin, whose bodies are laid out on the porch of the Carnton Mansion at the Battle of Franklin. But that's a year in advance. Right now, Hiram Granberry is a colonel in charge of a 7th Texas Regiment. So there are a fair number of Texans, at this point, about 3,200 or so Texans in the ranks of the Army of Tennessee. Now, let's get back to the tactical and strategic situation. That is Lookout Mountain that you're seeing in the picture right now. Not the part of Lookout Mountain you may be most familiar with, which of course is the end of the mountain north of the Tennessee River, no, south of the Tennessee River, near Chattanooga. This is much farther. This is miles and miles to the southwest. Lookout Mountain, you see the little dip, the saddle there in the middle? That is the mountain pass that will lead to McLemore's Cove. This cove here on the southern end, southwestern end of Lookout Mountain is where the fighting for what will become the Battle of Chickamauga will begin. It's in this cove that Union troops are finally on the move. Once again, General Halleck in the War Department and President Lincoln have been pushing, as well as Secretary of War Stanton, pushing Rosecrans to finally attack. So Rosecrans, who has 4 corps in his Army of the Cumberland, has split up his 4 corps, keeping Gordon Granger's corps in reserve, and has moved his other 3 corps under Pap Thomas, Crittenden, and Final Corps here into McLemore's Cove. So they're going to come down over the mountains, and they're going to enter this valley where the Confederates are going to start meeting them. The first engagement of what will become the Chickamauga battle, if you will, it is a separate engagement, but it's considered to be the first shots of Chickamauga, if you will, are fired at Davis's Crossroads in McLemore's Cove. So if you look on the map on the right, you'll see Crittenden's Corps. There's Pap Thomas's boys who have started the move south. And you can also see this long semicircular Confederate defenses that Braxton Bragg has set up using West Chickamauga Creek as one of his main defensive lines, and then Pigeon Mountains, much lower than Lookout Mountain, but Pigeon Mountains still are a fairly secure area, backed up by Peavine Ridge and some of the other small little ridges in the area. So again, this gives you a flavor of this map on where we're talking about. You see Chattanooga on the top. That's Crittenden's 21st Corps. There you see Wauhatchie, of course, will become a battlefield later in the war. But you get the idea that the Confederates are just kind of strung out. And Rosecrans now believes he can attack and win fights independently against these different elements. The problem is Bragg attacks first. He's going to send Patrick Cleburne. That's Cleburne's picture there in the center of the picture, born in Ireland on St. Patrick's Day. Patrick Romaine Cleburne is an extremely aggressive, very talented Confederate general, very outspoken, which may be why he's still a division commander and not a corps commander at this point in the war. But Cleburne's pretty good. He's certainly one of the best that Bragg has. And you can argue he's better than Bragg. Some people have made that argument over the years. But he's a division commander. And as such, he's got to do what his commander, Daniel Harvey Hill, former commander, of course, of a corps under Robert E. Lee in the Eastern Theater. D.H. Hill has now been moved out to the Western Theater, a recent addition to Bragg's army, much to Bragg's displeasure, mind you. He's not real thrilled about this North Carolinian coming into a Western army and commanding significant numbers of Western troops. But D.H. Hill will send Cleburne's division forward. They will go down to Davis's Crossroads in the middle of McLemore's Cove, and they will attack James Negley's Union division. And I think, again, a fairly insignificant fight. Casualties, of course, on both sides. Well, what lends the strategic implication, though, is that now Rosecrans knows these mountain passes on the south are guarded, that Bragg intends to stand and fight. In fact, Bragg is actually showing some unusual aggressiveness at this point in time, and Rosecrans, being somewhat, shall we say, conservative in his approach as a Union officer, decides that, okay, maybe the best approach is to kind of pull my troops together. So he's got to move Thomas north. So again, if you look on the map, you'll see Thomas there with the 14th Corps. They are going to slide north along the line where Hinman's troops are in Polk. That's Leonidas Polk, the fighting bishop, if you will. But Thomas is going to start moving back towards Chattanooga, towards the northeast. With that, Bragg is going to start moving his troops back to the northeast as well. That's going to set up what's going to happen then at Chickamauga. While this is going on, the Confederate War Department it's now late August, 1863. There's not much happening in the Eastern Theater. Everyone's licking their wounds after the Gettysburg campaign. And the War Department decides to send James Longstreet with the entire First Corps from the Army in Northern Virginia. Veterans of Gettysburg, of course, out to reinforce Bragg. Another Eastern general going west. D.H. Hill, of course, went west earlier, and now we've got Longstreet being sent west. But this time he's going to bring more than 20,000 soldiers with him. The problem is the Confederate rail system by this point in the war. It's abysmal. You can't, by the way, go through Chattanooga, that's gone. You can't go through East Tennessee because Ambrose Burnside in the Ninth Corps have now taken Knoxville. So all the railroad lines that led into Atlanta from the north are off limits. You can't do that. And most of the routes that go directly into it from even the Northeast are gone because Knoxville is under control. That leaves the Confederate War Department with one option and one option only, and that's to assemble a wide, diverse range of Confederate railroads, starting in Richmond, going all the way down to South Carolina, and then pulling them back up through East Georgia into Atlanta, and then sending them to North Georgia from there. It's a convoluted process. There's not enough trains to make it work. The gauges of the railroads are totally different. So that in many, many cases, these soldiers from Longstreet's men will endure very long, cramped train rides in small boxcars with men standing up for hours, being jostled back and forth in these train cars, being let out for hours on end on occasion, while they wait to be transferred to a new train that has a different gauge, and then they all have to reload everything, reload their supply wagons, reload all their ambulances, reload their horses, reload their men, reload their ammunition, and then proceed on the next railroad for a set period of time, and only have to repeat the whole process all over again. That is a disaster. As it turns out, more than 2/3 of Longstreet's men will not make it to Tennessee or to Georgia in time for the Battle of Chattanooga. 2/3 of his men never get there. Not a single gun, not one, of E. Porter Alexander, obviously famous for his earlier work at Gettysburg, but Porter Alexander's artillery, not a single gun will make it off a train in time to be used at Chickamauga. So while this is a noble undertaking on the Confederate War Department's front, and it works, I mean, they do finally get troops into this area, it is a royal pain in the rear. In fact, the only two early arrivals are going to be the Texas Brigade, John Bell Hood's Texans under Jerome Bonaparte Robertson, as well as Joseph Kershaw's South Carolina Brigade, both of whom are very familiar to those of us who study the Battle of Gettysburg. Hood's Texas Brigade will start arriving on the evening of September 17th, the eve of battle. The battle will start on September 18th. This is John Bell Hood. John Bell Hood had commanded a division in the attack on July 2nd at Gettysburg. As we all know, he had been severely wounded in one of his arms. He's had his arm in a sling when his men are departing Richmond. He is standing on the platform with his arm in a sling, saluting with his other hand as his men board. And the sight of his men going off on a campaign without him are too much for John Bell Hood. He manages to get his horse onto one of the train cars, and John Bell Hood, unknown to most of his men, will actually take a train to Georgia. His men are camped at Catoosa Station, north of Ringgold, Georgia, in the mountains of northwestern Georgia, and his men cheer wildly when suddenly John Bell Hood appears on his charger down off a train, and here he is in person, despite the fact that he's got his arm all shot to pieces still. He can barely move it. But Hood is, as we all know, is a very inspirational, very dynamic man, a born leader of men, although certainly impetuous and rash at times in his decisions, but a very able division commander whose men will fight like the Dickens when John Bell Hood is on the field. Jerome Bonaparte Robertson commands Hood's Texas Brigade. Hood commands the division, of course, with Evander Law and Lafayette, or can't remember who his other one is off the top of my head now. But bottom line is this Texas Brigade, and again, these are the troops that attacked Little Round Top and Devil's Den and Hawks Ridge during the fighting at Gettysburg. And we all know their names: 3rd Arkansas, 1st, 4th, and 5th Texas. They have suffered massive casualties at Gettysburg. They do have some new men in the ranks and some new officers in place. But by and large, most of these guys are veteran troops, and they're very, very good. And their presence are immediately quite interesting, because here are these troops that have just arrived off the train station. Now, you got to picture your mental image of Hood's Texans, right? Ragged Rebs. That's not true. They've got brand new uniforms at the Richmond Depot right before they left. And they're outfitted in these dark, almost like blue jean type fabric. So it's not really gray. It's more of a dark color, dark gray, but it's denim, if you will, jean material, brand new. And they look like bandbox soldiers. And now you got these real ragged Rebs from the Western Army who see these Easterners show up, even though, these boys are from Texas and Arkansas. They are from the Eastern Army in Northern Virginia. And there's instantly the kind of this, okay, who are these guys type of an attitude when Hood's Texas Brigade starts marching into position behind a new provisional brigade that Bragg has created with these troops that have arrived from Mississippi and other places. So with that arrival on the eve of the Battle of Chattanooga, with everybody that's arrived on both sides, the Army of the Cumberland, for one of the few battles from 1863 onward, where the Confederate Army actually outnumbers the Union Army, not by a lot, but they do outnumber them. Army of the Cumberland, 60,000 or so men. Again, that is William Rosecrans, in the upper left. He's got the 14th Corps under George Thomas, a Virginian who had stayed loyal to the Union. He's got the 20th Corps under McCook from Ohio, from about 2 hours from where I was born and raised. And of course, he's got Crittenden's 21st Corps and Gordon Granger's Reserve Corps. Gordon Granger, of course, is the same guy that you may have heard of recently in Texas with the Juneteenth celebrations. He is the Union commander that enforced the Emancipation Proclamation on June 19th, 1865 at Galveston, Texas. Same Gordon Granger. This is, of course, 2 years earlier, and he is commanding the reserves of the Army of the Cumberland. Now, there are 2 other men I should mention that are with Rosecrans here. One is the Assistant Secretary of War, Charles Dana. Secretary of War Edmund McMaster Stanton had been so frustrated with the lack of progress in Middle Tennessee that he sent his personal assistant, the second in command of the entire War Department, via train, hot rushed him out to Tennessee. Charles Dana has established telegraphic communication directly with Secretary of War Stanton, his boss. He's on the field. That's a problem. Anytime a commanding general's got the politicians, the War Department, sitting on his back door, wanting to know every single movement that Rosecrans is going to make, he knows Dana's going to be telegraphing that right back to Edwin Stanton. And of course, we know Lincoln and Halleck are certainly going to be reading those communiques as well. The second man is his chief of staff. The chief of staff of the Army of the Cumberland is a man whose name will also be familiar to you. His name is Brigadier General James Abram Garfield, future president of the United States. So Garfield is the chief of staff, if you will, and is coordinating all the staff activities for Rosecrans' army. Garfield has a tremendous amount of power within the army. Rosecrans relies on him. They are somewhat confidants. They do speak fairly regularly, at least at this point in the fighting. On the Confederate side, Braxton Bragg, you see in the upper right, he's got, again, 4 corps of infantry. Leonidas Polk, he's got D.H. Hill, of course. He's got Simon Bolivar Buckner, a veteran from the fighting at Fort Donelson and at Fort Henry back in 1862. And he's got William T.H. Walker as Reserve Corps. So again, both armies have a Reserve Corps and 3 operational corps. So they're set up very similarly. You've got Ormsby Mitchell in the cavalry for the Union Army, And the Confederates have two cavalry corps because Fighting Joe Wheeler and Nathan Bedford Forrest don't want to report to each other. So in his, kind of refusal to say one of you must be subordinate to the other, Wheeler's got an independent force. Nathan Bedford Forrest has got an independent force. That will create a few problems as we go downstream. Now, of course, they got these new reinforcements that have just arrived under Longstreet. And nobody at this stage knows how many men are going to truly arrive. There's a whole lot of them on the railroads in South Carolina and Georgia. But as I mentioned, Robertson's brigade is the first brigade to arrive. The rest of Hood's division will arrive short order. So it's September 18th. Braxton Bragg and Rosecrans kind of have the same idea. They're both starting to move to the northeast, thinking they can swing around the other's flank. This is almost somewhat reminiscent of First Bull Run, where Pope and Beauregard kind of circled the wagons for a while, thinking each one could turn the other's flank. This is going to happen early on at Chickamauga. Now, the key to a lot of this is the West Chickamauga Creek. Chickamauga, of course, some accounts suggest is a creek or maybe another Cherokee word for river of death. There are other etymologies that have been suggested for the word Chickamauga over the years. Whatever the river really meant, it's West Chickamauga Creek that it becomes important to our story. It's a fairly swift moving, fairly deep creek. There are some fords. These fords and bridges are very important. Starting in the north, you see Dyer's Bridge, Dyer's Ford. You will also see then Alexander's Bridge and Reed's Bridge. That's where the fighting for the Battle of Chickamauga will begin as Bragg starts sending infantry divisions push up against the cavalry, Union cavalry, and horse artillery that are defending these two respective bridges. Again, one of which is John T. Wouter. Remember, I mentioned the Lightning Brigade at Hoover's Gap. These guys that have these repeating rifles, they could shoot, I think actually some of them could fire up to 20 shots, if I recall now correctly. But these guys can lay down, they can load on, as they used to say, load on Sunday and fire all week long. But they're laying down tremendous amounts of firepower at these bridge crossings, particularly at Alexander's Bridge, meaning Reed's Bridge, which is defended by gentlemen with conventional Enfields and Springfield type rifle muskets. That may be the easiest point of entry. Also there at Lee and Gordon's Mills on the extreme southwest of the line, Hindman and Cheatham's, this is Benjamin Franklin Cheatham, their men are in William Preston. They are going to launch some rather aborted attempts to cross at Lee and Gordon's Mill, where again, Pap Thomas has arranged several of his men to resist that kind of attack. So here is some of the first action that starts on September 18th. This is, again, West Chickamauga Creek. That's a picture I took 5 or 6 years ago. The sketch there on the bottom left shows a wartime view of what this modest wooden plank bridge would have looked like. But the Yankees are going to defend the bridge. This is the 4th Michigan Cavalry, 7th Pennsylvania Cavalry, and the 4th U.S. Regulars. And they're supported by the Chicago Board of Trade Artillery Battery. Again, pretty good battery. These guys are going to hold off most of Bushrod Johnson's attacks throughout the day. Johnson's got 3 brigades. Gregg, who we talked about earlier, John Gregg. We got Fulton's brigade. We got McNair's brigade, McNair's brigade. These guys, again, have joined the Army fairly recently. Bushrod Johnson's been put in charge of all these additions from various forces in the Army of Mississippi and other troops. And there you see Robertson. That is Hood's Texans. That's the 1st Texas, 4th and 5th Texas, and the 3rd Arkansas. They're pretty much going to be held in reserve for most of the opening actions. The Yankees will pull up some of the bridge decking. They will not destroy the bridge, unfortunately. for their cause, and the Confederates will stream across Reed's Bridge after being able to rebuild it. They are going to push, this is Colonel Minty, who commands this brigade of Union cavalry. They're going to continue to push them back while Wouter's men at Alexander's Bridge are also withdrawing. Here's a painting by Dale Gallen that again shows Alexander's Bridge. Those are the men from the Lightning Brigade. They are John T. Wouter's boys that are fighting here against some of the men that have just arrived from the Walker's Reserve Brigade. Most of what goes on September 18th are these long attempts to cross at these two bridges and at Lee and Gordon's Mill on the dam at Lee and Gordon's Mill. It will take Bragg's army much of the day to secure the west bank of West Chickamauga Creek. By that time, nightfall is about upon us, and there's still uncertainty. It's exactly where Thomas's left is, where is the right of Bragg's army. They're kind of feeling each other out this point in time. And a rare night fight. Chickamauga is noted for having 2 consecutive night fights on 2 nights in a row, where most Civil War battles don't have any night battles. We've got 2 fairly significant battles that happen back to back. On the first night, we've got John Gregg with the 7th Texas and 5 or 6 Tennessee troops and Missourians. They are going to attack Wouter in the middle of the night. So John T. Wouter figures again in our story with the Lightning Brigade as they are going to fight. And again, if you picture it on the left, this is where the 7th Texas Infantry's position would have been as they are fighting against Wouter. Wouter's men will be there, defending this position. Both sides will shoot them up. There'll be several casualties in the middle of this fight, but nothing really happens again strategically, other than the fact that again, now Bragg's kind of got an idea of where the new Union line is, and Rosecrans has a similar feeling. All throughout the night, Rosecrans is going to keep pushing Thomas's corps to the northeast towards Chattanooga, again, filling in behind this new Union line that's now going to stretch from Lee and Gordon's Mills all the way up more than 3 miles to the north. On the morning of September 19th, the fighting at Chickamauga starts in earnest, and it's Nathan Bedford Forrest that gets the ball rolling with his dismounted troops. He assigns horse holders, standard cavalry / mounted infantry activity, and he will go into action at that point in time. Now, he's going to get pushed back. Again, he's fighting infantry, which in the middle of a woods, the infantry with their longer range rifles is eventually going to force Forrest to retreat. But about that time, here comes Matt Ector. Here's Matt Dillon, if you will, riding to the rescue. Matt Ector, leading from the front as he usually did, big strapping, Texan, well over 6 feet tall, big broad-shouldered dude, waving his sword, leading his men forward, and Ector's men crash into Croxton's brigade of Indianans, etc., and start retailing him back. He then hits King's brigade of U.S. regulars, and it starts really doing some damage. About that time, Pap Thomas pushes in Brannan's division with Vanderveer and Connell's brigades. They're going to hit Ector hard. It hit Ector really hard. And Ector's men, as well as Nathan Bedford Forrest, are going to pull back to where you see Jay's Mill on the map there, the little black square Jay's Mill. They'll form a new line along that road, and Matt Ector and Forrest's men are, in essence, out of the fight for the rest of the day. But with all these troops keep pouring north from Pap Thomas, he's going to keep feeding his other 2 divisions into the fray. At the same time, the Braxton Bragg is now pouring more and more troops across Alexander's Bridge, across Dyer's Bridge, Dyer's Ford, and across Reed's Bridge. And so with that fighting, Ector's going to at least try one more time. And again, you'll see him here in his fight before the regulars rally, and King's regulars will drive Ector for the field the final time. You'll also again see the battle continuing to spread towards the southeast, as again, Thomas is pushing more and more troops into this fighting. The morning action is, again, indecisive. Nobody's really gaining ground. As with many Civil War battles, guys are dying in the woods. Small fires are starting. This is September. It's been really dry. It's actually been unusually cold. There was an incredible cold snap the night before the battle, and many of these guys literally had to endure temperatures down in the 30s in September for this national cold snap that went all throughout the Midwest. Big snowstorms, in fact, in Minnesota and Wisconsin, places like that, the same weather front that brought sub-zero temp or sub-freezing temperatures to the mountains of North Georgia. But now the next day is hot. You go from these freezing temperatures back to typical September sunshine. But it's been really dry, and now the woods start catching on fire, and soldiers are starting to burn to death in the woods as the fighting continues and continues. Throughout the midday, again, lots of troops in the center of the line are shooting at each other. Alexander Stewart's division joins the fray. St. John Liddell is there. Frank Cheatham, Bushrod Johnson comes into play. You can again see most of the 14th Corps and the 20th Corps, Crittenden's Corps, is now arriving as well. And you're starting to bring men up from a number of different Union forces. And again, you just see these movements, everybody sidling towards the Northeast or towards the North, and you're getting more and more troops. Another recent arrival is John C. Breckinridge, the former Vice President of the United States, Kentuckian, will arrive with his division on the field. They're from D.H. Hill's Corps. Behind them is Patrick Claiborne. They have come down from Pigeon Mountain, from McLemore's Cove, and are now hot rushing to West Chickamauga Creek. And so again, throughout the middle of the day, you can see in the yellow circle, our good friend John Bell Hood sitting in reserve, much as he had on September 18th. Hood, very impetuous, very anxious to shoot some Yankees, get some revenge for his injury at Gettysburg, is chafing at and chomping at the bit, wanting to go in. Well, about this time, Union forces shoot down John Gregg, the tall Texan, who will drop in the woods. He is rescued by oncoming members of the 1st Texas, who find their fellow Texas general laying in the woods, save his life. He is, within an inch of dying, but he will be saved, and John Gregg will be taken to the rear. Hood's Texas Brigade now takes the front, and they slam into the Union forces at Vineyard Farm. This is now in the right center of the Union line, the Vineyard Farm, in this wonderful photograph or a painting by Bruce Marshall that adorns the rear of Joe's and my book. You can see a number of these troops. There's John Gregg again on the top. 7th Texas Hiram Granberry takes command of the fallen Gregg's brigade. Granberry will now command that brigade for the rest of the campaign. John Gregg will not return to the Army until 1864, when he will be shot and killed during the Petersburg campaign while commanding Hood's Texas Brigade, Hood's Texas Division, if you will, at that point. But you can see the attack that's playing here. Again, dense, overgrown woods on small, hard scrapple farms with log cabins. Not a lot of eastern fencing. There's some, but not a lot of fences. This is really a battle of woods and open spaces. Unlike Gettysburg, that's a battle of stone walls and fences, and as well as woods and rocks and things like that. Again, you can see a number of these troops that are engaged. I do want to call your attention to 3 guys here. One, there's Wilder again, who seemingly is everywhere. John T. Wilder's reputation is going to be cemented between Hoover's Gap and Chickamauga. He does just a marvelous job throughout this. The second guy I want to pay attention to is just immediately north of the 98th Illinois. In the left center of the picture, you see Lilly's Battery. That is Captain Eli Lilly. Name familiar to you? Eli Lilly Pharmaceuticals from Indianapolis, of course. Eli Lilly commands an Indiana artillery battery, and it's his actions as a battery commander during the Civil War that leads his desire to develop new pharmaceuticals to help treat wounded soldiers during the years after the war, and that leads to the massive conglomeration now known as Eli Lilly Corporation. But it starts with Captain Eli Lilly in his fighting here. That is Don Carlos Buell, who is in the middle there. That is the same Buell, of course, that had been so instrumental at the Battle of Shiloh back in 1862. The final Yankee I want to mention is the topmost name of the Union troops. That's Hans Hegg. Now, he commands troops from Wisconsin as well as some troops in Kansas, some Ohioans, etc. Well, Hans Hegg is a Norwegian. Many of his troops are Norwegians. They're again from Wisconsin, 15th Wisconsin Infantry. Hans Hegg will die here at Chickamauga, but he will do a absolutely wonderful job of commanding his men before he dies. He will get a very nice statue that will later be erected in Madison, Wisconsin in his memory. So these are the guys who are defending against Hood's Texans. And again, the Texans are coming in, in these dark blue, bluish gray, jean denim type uniforms in many cases, and they are shooting them up with the Yankees. This field, Vineyards Farm, becomes the slaughterhouse. There are troops from both, almost like the wheat field at Gettysburg. Troops will counterattack. Guys are coming back and forth, back and forth. Florida Brigade comes into play. Arkansas troops. Bushrod Johnson will send in many of his men. Tennesseans are all over this place. You've got then, of course, Evander Law's guys from Gettysburg get heavily involved here. William Oates, another name very familiar to us from Gettysburg. Oates, of course, is the guy who commands the Alabama troops that will attack Little Round Top against Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. William Oates is here at Chickamauga, having been one of the men that and has ridden a train to get here. Oates will perform really well at Chickamauga. His men will take a pounding. A lot of the guys who live through the hell of Gettysburg die at Chickamauga after during this multi-day 2-week train ride to get there, only to perish within hours after stepping off the train. Well, that evening, again, nothing going on. Both sides are just kind of sitting there. And this battle has been called the Soldiers' Battle because both Rosecrans and Bragg, and to a large degree, have kind of lost contact with reality and what's going on. Nobody can really see it. It's dense. There's woods. Some of the woods are on fire. There's canopies of smoke, thick black or white smoke, depending on the powder, and it's god-awful mess. In some cases, individual captains and lieutenants are commanding segments of battlefields because they don't know where the generals are or the colonels. They're long gone. People are just confused, and men are shooting at their own regiments, shooting at their friendly troops. I mean, this is just a nightmare. And then in the middle of this, Patrick Cleburne decides to launch a night attack. The second night in a row, we're going to have night action. This is a big time attack. Cleburne's going to take his entire division and launch a very spirited attack. So there you see again, Leonidas Polk actually, this is not Leonidas Polk, this is his nephew. But they are going to launch this attack. Dodge, by the way, on the bottom, that is the Union general for which Dodge City, Matt Dillon, which Dodge City is later going to be named for. That is the Union commander on the right flank of this. Dodge's men are going to be routed as Deschler's brigade. This is again our friend from West Point, the veteran Alabama young soldier in his 20s. James Deschler launches a very, very confused attack. Middle of that, William Preston, a brigade commander next to him, gets shot and killed. And in this night fight, now things really get hairy. Treetops are on fire, and the battlefield is illuminated by these torch-like trees, these big conifers, that the whole tops of them were on fire from the artillery shells that are exploding in the air. And so people are dying left and right in here. There are documented cases of field hospitals burning up, killing everybody in the field hospitals that are just laying there hopelessly in the night, waiting for to be treated. It is a mess. Dodge is going to rout Richard Johnson's going to rout. Starkweather's going to pull back. Scribner's going to pull back. The whole Yankee line here will collapse. But it's the middle of the night. You know, it's 10, 11 o'clock at night. And you really can't see. And again, you're in these burning woods. And so Claiborne, ever aggressive, desperately wants to push forward, but he just simply can't. His men are too confused. They're all mixed up. He's lost much tactical cohesion of his entire division. The Yankees are an even worse mess, but neither side can really do much. With that, September 19th comes to a close at Chickamauga. It's now the morning of September 20th. James Deshler will die this morning. Deshler, the young Alabama soldier commanding the Arkansas parolees. His men, by the way, will never again be called the Arkansas Post parolees because they stand and they fight really, really well. And they're putting up an intense firefight with Union soldiers to the point where they're starting to run out of ammunition. And James Deshler, perhaps more brave than practical, perhaps not thinking of his own safety, but Deshler decides he's going to kind of crouch down, go along his line on the reverse of this little ridge line that his men are holding, and Deshler is shot through the heart by a cannon shell, probably a parrot shell, rips his heart from his body, dies instantly, of course, and is laying there surrounded by his Arkansas and Texas troops on this ridgeline. And the mortuary marker there on the right is for James Deshler, the highest ranking Texan who will die at the battle. He's the second Texan general to be shot here. Of course, John Gregg is now out of commission as well. Now Deshler is out of commission. But if you look on the map on the left, you'll see the tactical situation in the morning of the 20th. You'll see this Union salient. That is Kelly's Field. So those of you who are familiar with the Chickamauga battlefield, tremendous amount of monuments and markers to the Union troops along there. The Texas State Monument is along there, roughly where Claiborne line is, of course. But it gives you an idea of what the situation looks like. And the Union line holds pretty well. John C. Breckinridge will lead some attacks on the northern part of the line. One of his brigade commanders, Benjamin Helm, will die mortally wounded. Now, Benjamin Helm is a kin to Mary Todd Lincoln. And Mary Todd Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln are quite fond of Benjamin Helm. And when Benjamin Helm dies, I think he's actually the nephew of Mary Todd Lincoln, if I'm not mistaken. Benjamin Helm's death will cause almost as much grief in the White House for Mary Todd Lincoln as had the death of William Wallace Lincoln and Tad Lincoln, her two sons earlier. This is just a devastating, it's just another of a long line of events that will eventually unhinge Mary Todd Lincoln to the point where Robert Todd Lincoln will much later have to commit her to a sanitarium. But these attacks by John C. Breckinridge accomplished nothing but the death of brave men, as somebody will later say. States Right Gist, St. John Liddell, D.H. Hill will keep pouring troops in, and they will not turn the flank. James Negley, Fort Negley, later named for him. James Negley will do a really good job here of moving troops around and trying to stem a repeated Confederate attacks. Leonidas Polk, by the way, gets into a personal argument with Braxton Bragg because Bragg wants Polk to be more aggressive and attack. Can't find Polk. There's this mishash of orders. Polk doesn't think that he's got the right orders in place. Polk and Bragg will literally almost have an argument over what's going on here. In the middle of us, James Longstreet just takes control. Longstreet, in the center, basically takes command of everything. Typical Longstreet style. For those of you who think Longstreet's a defensive general, not at Chickamauga. He takes command of almost everybody in the center, and here we go. Let's go, boys. And Longstreet will start launching attack after attack after attack. Anybody that thinks James Longstreet is sitting on his haunches at Gettysburg because he wants to fight a defensive battle has never studied Chickamauga, because Longstreet is by no means wanting to move to the right or wanting to sit around and wait for Evander Law. He's not sitting around waiting on counter marches he is pushing forward at Chickamauga, and he's pushing forward hard. Problem is, these Yankees are really good. These guys are veterans. You know, they've been fighting in the West for 2 years. Most of these guys know what they're doing. In a lot of cases, they're better armed, better equipped. And so the Army of Tennessee, which Longstreet doesn't know much about these guys, is new subordinates, Frank Cheatham, you know, Bushrod Johnson, Tom Hyndon, William Preston. He doesn't know these guys. Never met most of them in his life until this morning. Now he commands them, and he's pushing them forward. What opens the door to Longstreet's vicious counterattack or vicious attack is a Union mistake, actually a series of mistakes. Where remember, Pap Thomas has been pushing troops northward, ever northward. Well, somehow or another, the orders don't quite connect, and some of his men pull out of the line and keep moving northward, thinking that's what they're supposed to do. It opens a huge gap near the Brotherton cabin in the Union line at exactly the time that John Bell Hood and James Longstreet and Alexander Stewart and Frank Cheatham are all leading this massive attack forward. They're going to split the Union troops in two, and they're going to start penetrating. And for a moment, it looks like the end of Rosecrans' army is nigh, except a rather obscure Union Brigadier General, later to be quite famous, by the name of Philip Sheridan, comes galloping into the scene. Here's Sheridan, an infantry commander at this point. This is not the Sheridan of the Shenandoah Valley of 1864, commanding cavalry. This is a Union Infantry Brigade commander from Somerset, Ohio, 10 miles from my hometown. And Phil Sheridan leads a very spirited counterattack along with a Cincinnati Brigadier General, Colonel, actually by the name of Lytle, America's poet laureate, if you will. He's shot down, but Sheridan will stem the tide with Jefferson Davis, the Union Jefferson Davis, that's Jefferson C. Davis, and a number of other Union troops. And there's our friend Wilder again, who just seemingly is all over the Chickamauga battlefield. But here's Wilder launching a counterattack of his own with his Lightning Brigade, with these, again, repeating rifles that they have, and they're shooting them up big time. Longstreet's attack will push through the Brotherton cabin, and they'll start moving north into North Dyer Field. Here comes Joseph Kershaw, again from Battle of Gettysburg. These are the guys that attacked the Rose Farm at Gettysburg and the Peach Orchard line. And behind them is Humphreys. Now, that had been Barksdale's brigade at Gettysburg. You're familiar with William Barksdale, of course. Barksdale dies at Gettysburg, and Humphreys now has command, Benjamin Grubb Humphreys, now has command of what had been Barksdale's Mississippians. Again, all these guys are fresh off the train, 1 or 2 days off the train ride from Virginia. And here they are on a Civil War battlefield pushing uphill. If you ever walked North Dyer's Field, that's uphill almost all the way. So these guys are exhausted, they're tired, but they're flush with victory. And so off they go. You see on the map on the left, you see again, Benning, again, the same Benning that was at Gettysburg. This is part of Lafayette McLaw's division that's now arrived as well. And then leading the attack, as usual, is Hood's Texans. That's Jerome Robertson, of course, leading it. You can again see familiar faces. There's Buell, etc. You've got a number of troops that are going to just fight their way through this. Yankee guns are going to be captured in mass. They're going to be recaptured. Men are going to get shot down. If you look at the photograph on the right, you'll see this little knob of trees. There's kind of an indentation in the center that looks like, it's pointing kind of northward. And just to the right of that is this tree line. Well, just to the left of that, the little knoll there is the point of attack. That's where a lot of these Texans are aimed for. And they're going to get slammed with reinforcement after reinforcement after reinforcement, as Rosecrans and his chief of staff, Garfield, and Crittenden and Thomas just keep feeding more and more troops into this fray. And as you can see, while all this is going on, back down at Kelly's Field, Claiborne and Preston are now leading attacks. John Breckinridge is back in action with Walker. and they are finally going to crack the Kelly's field line. So these Yankees will start pulling back. Granger will start pulling back. Pap Thomas will start pulling back. As Kershaw, Johnson, Evander Law, again, these very familiar names to us, continue to push. Rosecrans will ride off the field about this point in time, starting feverishly to look for reinforcements. John Bell Hood will go down a second time this summer. He loses the use of an arm, doesn't have it amputated, of course, it's in a sling. Now he's going to lose a leg, and he actually loses the leg. Much like Stonewall Jackson, he's going to go on a circuitous route to get him off the battlefield well to the rear. Unlike Jackson, John Bell Hood will live, but down goes Hood. Rosecrans will eventually leave the field with James Garfield, and they will head towards Chickamauga. He'll send Garfield back to try to organize what's going on behind him. Crittenden will also leave the field, and Pap Thomas, and pretty much now has command of everything. And it's a total mishmash. Some of you are my age remember these wonderful illustrations, these Greenspan illustrations that were from the American Heritage Golden History of the Civil War back from the 60s when we were kids. I always loved those. I actually got my start as a war gamer by taking those little maps there, going out of my dad's apple orchard with my little toy soldiers and recreating Chickamauga or Gettysburg or whatever battle. These Greenspan maps by, I think, I can't remember what David Greenspan, what his first name was. But this shows there's the last ditch effort of George Thomas to try to rally troops around the Snodgrass house. On Snodgrass Hill, on 2 or 3 adjoining small eminences, and they're basically fighting for their lives as wave after wave after wave of Confederate attacks all afternoon long on September 20th, just keep pounding and pounding the position. Thomas will go down in history for his sobriquet, the Rock of Chickamauga, as he holds off the Texans, the Arkansas, the South Carolinians, the Virginians, all these boys that are coming at him, you know, wave after wave of Tennesseans, etc., Alabama or Arkansans. They're just hitting them time and time and time and time again. But Thomas's men will stand firm. They'll buy enough time for Crittenden and Granger to form a new defensive line near Chattanooga and prepare for the Union withdrawal back to Chattanooga in the end of what has been the Battle of Chickamauga. There'll be some late cavalry engagements. Wheeler's Texas Brigade, including Terry's Texans under Colonel Harrison. They'll fight some fights near Glaston Mill. Nathan Bedford Forrest, who's on the other end of the line, will do some more work as well. But this is mostly going to be a fight by Fighting Joe Wheeler's men on the south side of the battlefield to kind of push forward and try to block the routes of retreat. In fact, there'll be a fairly significant Confederate attack on retreating Union cavalry from Kentucky that'll take place back near McLemore's Cove, where all this whole thing started just north of Davis's Crossroads. And a lot of Kentucky troops will successfully defend the mountain pass and keep Fighting Joe Wheeler from ripping into Chattanooga before the arrival of the Union infantry. With that, Chickamauga comes to a close. September 18th, 19th, and 20th, a 3-day battle, much like Gettysburg. The 2 worst battles of the Civil War are fought pretty much just 4 short months apart. Actually, less than that, 3 months apart. 16,000 of Rosecrans' men are gone. 18,000 of Bragg's men are gone. Second most casualties of the entire Civil War. There you see the chart. Gettysburg, 51,000 casualties. Chickamauga, 34,000. Spotsylvania, Wilderness, Chancellorsville. These are all Eastern battles. Chickamauga is in effect a Eastern battle fought in the West. It's on the scale of a Gettysburg. It's on the scale of a Spotsylvania. It contains many of the same troops. Longstreet's boys, of course. And this is a rarity for the West, where many of the battles are relatively smaller than these massive fights in the open fields of the East. Chickamauga will lead to a number of Confederate and Union changes in command structure. Longstreet is so fed up with the whole thing. He and Bragg don't get along. Bragg has the War Department ship Longstreet out to Knoxville to go fight Ambrose Burnside. Leonidas Polk, Simon Butler, D.H. Hill, a newly arrived William J. Hardy. They all conspire against Bragg. War Department finally decides to replace Bragg with Joseph Johnston. Johnston will take command of the troops in the theater. Well, frustrated still, Abraham Lincoln with William S. Rosecrans will decide that Rosecrans' inept performance, if you will, in the War Department, it's debatable. Some people, I think, blame Rosecrans a little worse than maybe he deserves. But Rosecrans will end up losing his job and being replaced by one U.S. Grant. And Grant then will start his rise to ascendancy in the West. And he will bring, of course, William T. Sherman to prominence. Phil Sheridan will rise in prominence. Pat Thomas, of course, and the new really reconstituted armies of Army of the Ohio, Army of the Cumberland will then eventually go after Atlanta now that Chattanooga has fallen to the Yankees. On behalf of my co-author, Joe Owen, on behalf of our publisher, Savis Beatty, I'd like to thank Kelly and the good folks at the American Civil War Museum. Fantastic museums, by the way, both in Richmond and, of course, at Appomattox. I've had the privilege of being there. I've actually spoke at both facilities, well, actually at the old Museum of the Confederacy a few years ago. But I'd encourage everybody, if you've never been to these sites, please give them a visit. They're phenomenal repositories of not only Civil War history, but of the entire period, if you will. So with that, I'll turn it back to Kelly. And again, thank you very much for your time and attention tonight.
All right. So how large were the Texas unit's casualties in proportion to the other Army of Tennessee units at Chickamauga?
Good question. There are 4,200 Texans that fight at Chickamauga. About a quarter of them will go down. In the appendix of our book, and I did almost all the work in the appendix personally, I scoured every single available record I can get my hands on. And again, about a quarter of them will fall. Now that's actually about on par with most of Bragg's army. Again, a quarter is fair. I mean, some units will lose 30, 40%. Others will be 10, depending on where they're at in the ferocity of fighting. But it's on par. It's certainly on par. It's not significantly worse than anybody else, but it is certainly as desperate a fighting as anybody's going to do in this field. One thing I liked about, by the way, writing this book is that Texans, as you can tell from the presentation, are present at just every major phase of the fighting. So you can tell the story of the Battle of Chickamauga strictly by looking at Texas records, as Joe and I did. And you can tell the whole story of the battle just by that. You can't do that with Ohio. You can't do that with Indiana. Can't do that with Arkansas or Tennessee. You really can do it with Texas. And so that was kind of unique because as we were laying out the book, it's like, I don't have to fill in the blanks as to what was going on elsewhere because the Texans are there for just about everything.
Now, did the Texans receive special mention in Bragg's report of the battle?
They reported to Longstreet and John Bell Hood. And again, there's politics involved. So, you know, they're not specially commendated, if you will. You know, I'm sure Bragg obviously is thankful to the War Department for sending these reinforcements. But it leads to one comment. You know, there's this great question that everybody at Gettysburg gets so tired of. What if Stonewall Jackson was at Gettysburg? I'll give you a different what if that actually to me is more germane. What if Longstreet's entire corps is at Chickamauga? This is already a Confederate victory, as it is, with 16,000 of Longstreet's men not there, and not a single of Longstreet's artillery pieces there, not one. So here's a real what if. What if those trains, what if the South had the same infrastructure on the trains as the North did, and you didn't have to move people from gauge to gauge because the gauges didn't match, and you could just simply ship Longstreet's entire corps and all of his guns to Chickamauga on the day before the battle? How do you think this would play out at that point where now the Confederates have, an advantage of 20,000 men over Rosecrans? So while we speculate uselessly about Stonewall Jackson, we really should, if you're a Southerner, I'm not, I'm a Buckeye, but Southerners should lament forever the fact that their infrastructure was so bad that Chickamauga doesn't this, Waterloo of the West, as it could have been. I mean, they're already routing the Union Army minus Longstreet's, the rest of his boys. Just think, if Longstreet's, rest of his men could have arrived there, and in particular his artillery could have got there because their artillery was really, really good, as you know, with E. Porter Alexander, Walton and all these guys.
Yeah, that's an interesting argument or interesting thought. Yeah. And one last question we'll take. It's about Hood's loss of his leg and then his becoming addicted to the painkillers. How did that affect his judgment as commander of the Army of Tennessee later in the war?
Great question. Now, we were privileged to be able to use the work of Sam Hood. Sam Hood is a fellow Savage Beatty author. He is a direct descendant of the Hood family. He has paperwork from his wounding at Chickamauga that will suggest that they did not overly stick Hood with laudanum or any other opiate. He will argue vehemently that John Bell Hood was lucid. They did not have a painkiller addiction, unlike popular histories. Again, I'm just repeating what Sam is, commending in his books. And he's got the medical facts that seem to prove it because he's got the actual medical records of the doctors who treated John Bell Hood the rest of the war. And there's very little mention of any kind of opiate at all. That being said, John Bell Hood has lost the use of an arm and he's lost an actual leg. How many people in any job can endure that? I had a brother-in-law, a dear brother-in-law of mine who lost a leg. Very efficient man, but it took something away from him mentally because, piece of you is missing. Something changed, in people like that who lose appendages. John Bell Hood's lost the use of an arm and he's lost a leg. I'll submit to you that far more than his alleged painkiller addiction, which may or may not be true. There's plenty of evidence on one side. Sam Hood says absolutely no. But there's plenty of psychological evidence that John Bell Hood is trying basically to win the war by himself in 1864. My ancestor, one of my ancestors, a 15-year-old rifleman in the 51st Ohio, will shoot up the Confederates at Franklin and Nashville in the 51st Ohio in 1864, when John Bell Hood, of course, launches these massive Chickamauga type attacks, Gettysburg type attacks, which by this point in the war aren't going to work. But in 1863 and 1862, they had worked. So Hood has got this memory of, okay, just everybody go. Yankees eventually will crack. They cracked at Chickamauga. They're not going to crack, of course, at Nashville and Franklin. And my 15-year-old ancestor, who becomes the last Civil War soldier, left in his county in East Central Ohio when he dies in 1934, leaving firsthand accounts of the Civil War to my mom, who was 13 at the time. My interest in the Civil War, having heard from my mom one generation away from what actually happened in the 51st Ohio at places like Franklin and Nashville. But yeah, I mean, it's a long-winded answer, but I really think John Bell Hood somewhat gets a bad rap. But I do think 1864, he's not the right man for the job by any stretch of the imagination. So back to you, Kelly.
And thank you for that. And just your comments there really show how this war was not that long ago.
No, in fact, there's one extra comment I'll make. My mom died about 5 years ago or so. My daughter's 30 years old. 50 years from now, picture this, 50 years from now, fast forward, we had the 200th anniversary of Gettysburg. 50 years from now, she will be an 80-year-old lady. She can tell people she heard Civil War stories one generation away from the actual people. 80 or 50 years from now, one generation away. And we think the Civil War was long ago. It kind of was, but keep in mind that our fathers, grandfathers, they knew these Civil War veterans well into the 20th century. And so we're not that far away from these stories.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And thank you for sharing the story of the Texans at Chickamauga. We have the book in our bookshop. And I believe it is signed. I know we were working on getting those.
Yeah, I think they're signed book plates. Yeah.
So, so if you want to purchase the book in our shop, it's available online. I'm seeing Robert says excellent talk, and so does Sue. So
thank you, guys.
Again, thank you. And thank you all for joining us tonight. Certainly, if you haven't been to one of our museums, come on by and see us whenever you're in the area. We have at the American Civil War Museum just opened our theater. So we've got about a 12-minute introductory film now. Lots of people come to the museum and they ask, do you have a movie? So now we can say yes to that. Thank you all for your support, and special thanks to our members. And if you're not a member, consider becoming one to help us do the work that we are doing and want to continue doing. Well, everyone, have a good night. And again, thank you so much, Scott. That was an excellent presentation.
Thank you very much. Have a good night, everyone.